Wel, anwyl gyfeillion, mae'n fraint i ddod mae hyn o. O'n i wedi cael sioc a syndod i gael y gwahoddiad. I was absolutely amazed to have the invitation. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi. Dylwn ni esbonio yn y lle cyntaf beth oedd cysylltiad yn had yn ystod y rhyfel gyda Waldo. Nhw'n hen gyfeillion oherwydd bod yn had yr athro David Williams wedi cael ei penodi i Goleg Caerdydd yn 1930 ar yr un diwrnod. Ac o'n nhw'n gyfeillion cynnes iawn ac agos iawn ar hyd yr amser. Ac oedd David Williams yn ffrindiau mawr at theulu Waldo yn Sir Benfro yn wedig ar ôl iddyn nhw symud i ogledd y sir o Prendergast. I should explain that my father and David Williams, who was the professor of history in Aberystwyth, were appointed to the university in Cardiff on the same day in 1930, and they were very close friends. And David Williams was in childhood and in youth, a neighbour of Waldo Williams's family in Pembrokeshire. He knew the parents and greatly admired the family background of Waldo. So the connection between my father and Waldo really was made by David Williams in the 1930s, in the time when the great poem Cofio was written here in Hoplas. In 1931. Felly oedd y cysylltiad yn mynd yn ôl yn y lle cyntaf i'r 30au, a wedyn oedd yn had yn gwybod am Waldo yn arfais y Steddfod ac yn y blaen, o'n nhw yn nabod I gilydd fel petai, fel llenorion yn y 30au. Ond wedyn ni fe ddath y cyswllt arbennig yma yn 1939. Then things changed in 1939 with the much advertised war, Second World War. And that posed a problem for people in universities, and David Williams and my father were drafted into the Ministry of Labour in 1939, and by 1942 my father found himself as the Secretary of the Tribunal for Wales on national service and on deferment from national service. Felly erbyn 1942 fe symudwyd yn had o jyst I fod yn y weinyddiaeth lafur I edrych I fod yn sgrifennydd Tribunlys Cymru oedd yn delio gyda gorfodaeth filwrol a ryddhad oddi wrth orfodaeth filwrol. Felly, erbyn 1942, dyna oedd yn had yn wneud. Ac oedd David Williams hefyd yn y weinyddiaeth, ond mewn ran oedd ychydig bach yn uwch, ac oedd David Williams yn fawr iawn I barch. David Williams himself was higher up in the Ministry of Labour and earned great praise in the Ministry of Labour for his reports and his judgment, indeed. Oedd pob math o geisiadau yn dod o flaen y Tribunlys yma yng Nghaerdydd ac yn Bae Colwyn ac yn blaen o'n nhw'n cyfarfod ar draws Cymru. Wy'n cofio yr arlunydd John Elwyn yn dweithio bod e'n hynod o ddiolchgar in had am ymryd yn y Tribunlys ac wneud e'n bosibl iddo fe gael ryddhad amodol oddi wrth bod yn y fyddin, a fe ffindodd yn had waith I John Elwyn ar ffarm yng Nghyrion Caerdydd yn Llysfaen neu Llanisien. Rhywle fel 'na. Oedd John Elwyn bob amser yn ddiolchgar i'n had am I ymyrraeth yn y mater. John Elwyn, for example, the artist, was a pacifist, but he was given conditional discharge, and my father John Elwyn, the artist, always said he was very grateful to my father for intervening and getting him a wonderful job in a marvellous farm for the duration of the war in Lisvein and Llanisien in the outskirts of Cardiff. And he always remained grateful for that. And there was another intervention, oedd na un tro, oedd na iddew ifanc o Gaerdydd wedi cael gorfodaeth milwrol, ac oedd y tad yn trio dadle gerbron yn had ar Tribunlys na ddyle'r mab ddim wneud gwasanaeth milwrol oherwydd bod y ffatri ddillad oedd gyda nhw yng nghanol Caerdydd yn gwneud dillad i'r fyddin. Felly tybed all yn had drefnu ryddhad, a mi drefnodd yn had hynny. Ac bore tranoth mi ddath yr hen iddew yma mewn i'r swyddfa, A gofyn yn had fynd lawr ar ei luniau, a derbyn gweddiau i ddewig y tad, a bendith y tad. Oedd y tad yn dweud, cyfiawn wyt yn Israel am helpu yn cenedl ni. Dyna oedd y weddi. Oedd yn had yn gyfiawn yn Israel yn ôl y weddi yma, a'r fendith yma, ar oddwyd iddo fe. Felly, o'ch chi'n cael pob math o geisiadau ac o'ch chi ambell waith yn gallu ymyrryd, ambell waith o'ch chi ddim. Ond oedd dim unrhyw gais yn debyg i gais Waldo, 1942. You have several extraordinary interventions my father had to make. One of them was an old Jewish merchant in Cardiff had a factory making military uniforms, and he demanded that his son should be freed to run the factory because it was helping the war effort. And my father did what he could and allowed the boy to be let off military service or postponed military service. And the next morning, the old man came in and demanded that my father went down on his knees, and then he placed his hands upon my father's head and said, "Righteous art thou in Israel," and blessed him and his seed forever, because he had freed his boy from military service. That was the most extraordinary moment, I think, of the office of the tribunal on national service. But none of those requests were quite the same as the request that came from Waldo Williams in 1942. Doedd dim unrhyw gais yr un fath a chais Waldo yn 1942. Roedd Waldo wedi sgwennu pregeth gyfriniol iawn, ac oedd yn had yn dweud, wel, allech chi dyngu bod chi, oedd e'n dweud, allech chi dyngu bod William Blake y bardd yn siarad â chi ynglyn â phroblemau ryfel ar ddiwedd y 19th ganrif yn amser y chwyldro Ffrengig. Waldo had written a long screed to the tribunal for pacifism against all war, not just in favor of his own freedom from military service, but he was against every war and all war, and it was expressed in very mystical terms. My father said it was exactly like reading a request by William Blake himself for a refusal to do military service in the British armies against the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. That's what my father said. It was so mystical and so Blakean, and he didn't know how to deal with this request. So he must have had some dealings with David Williams on this matter, I think. He never said so, but I'm sure he must have done that, because David was much more Machiavellian. He was much more clever than my father. My father was much more simple. But being a Pembrokeshire man, he could see further than rather. We in Glamorgan are rather thick, in fact, compared with Pembrokeshire people. And David must have found some way. And my father secretly wrote a letter to the judge, Frank Davies, whom he greatly admired, as a very, very fair-minded man. Mi benderfynodd yn had sgwennu llythyr yn gwbl gyfrinachol, ac oedd e'n peryglu I swydd I hunan, gwbl gyfrinachol I geisio sbonio beth oedd daliadau pacifistaidd a heddychol Waldo, yn erbyn rhyfel, yn erbyn pob rhyfel, yn erbyn pob anghydfod o'r math yma, y dyle ac yn pwysleisio brawdoliaeth dyn, ac oedd yn had yn dweud oedd yr holl beth yn debyg I William Blake. Fel petai William Blake yn siarad â chi yn erbyn, mynd I ryfel yn erbyn y chwyldro Ffrangeg. So my father wrote this letter secretly to the judge, and knowing the judge to be a man of very fair-minded temperament. And the judge said, and my father just explained what Waldo's arguments were. And so the judge received the letter in very good spirit and said, look, don't you come to the tribunal. I will deal with it. You say that you're unwell and don't come, so that nobody will suspect that you had a hand in it. So, a felly, pan ddath y tribunalis a darllen y bregeth mae gan Waldo ynglyn â heddychiaeth gerbron y tribunalis, fe roddwyd ryddhad di amod gan Frank Davies I Waldo. Doedd dim amodau, dim rhaid gweithio ar fferm, doedd dim rhaid mynd lawr gwaith glo fel befin boy. Frank Davies, when the tribunal came, decided to give Waldo complete freedom, unconditional freedom from military service for the remaining years of the war. He wasn't required to work on a farm or go down the mine or anything. He was almost the only person in Wales throughout those years of war given completely unconditional freedom from military service. And so afterwards, then we would meet Waldo in Dinas Cross in Pembrokeshire, in North Pembrokeshire, from 1945 onwards. O 1945 ymlaen, pan ddath yr heddwch, gan bod cysylltiadau teuluol gan yn had, oedd teulu yn had yn dod o ardal Neiland a Johnston yn ne'r sir, de Sir Benfro, ac oedd cysylltiadau gyda mam gyda'r Perkinses, teulu mawr o Perkinses sydd yn byw yn Dinas Cross yng ngogledd y sir. Felly, cyn gyda'r heddwch, oedd yn had yn awyddus iawn i roi cyd-destun gwledig Cymraeg i iaith i Rodri a fi. Dyna'r pwynt, a felly eithon ni ddim ar yn gwyle i Sir Benfro, ond i Dinas Cross. Ac yn Dinas Cross, trwy rhyw ryfedd wyrth, yr oedd Mrs Francis, chwa'r Waldo, yn briod a Mr Francis, penneth yr ysgol yno, a tad Gareth ac Eluned Francis. Wy'n falch iawn i weld Eluned yma heddi. Ac so when we got to Dinas Cross in 45, my father was really very keen because although his family came from Neyland and Johnston and areas in the south of Pembrokeshire, my mother's connections were with Ffynon and the Perkinses in Dinas Cross. And so she found a guest house in Dinas Cross. And when we got to, my father was anxious to have a Welsh context because we had never really been brought up in a Welsh area. We'd been brought up in Cardiff. And so one of the great delights of coming to Dinas Cross, we discovered that Waldo's sister lived there, Mrs Francis, the wife of the schoolmaster, Mr Francis, and the mother of Gareth and Eluned Francis. And I'm very glad to see Eluned Francis here today, Mrs Eluned Richards. And it was a great delight then to go up to the Francis. The Francises would come down to meet David Williams. I should explain, David Williams would always come with us because he just lost his wife, his first wife, very suddenly. And so he needed to recuperate by coming down to Pembrokeshire, recuperate, and he was so glad to show Pembrokeshire, his own area, his own bro to us as children, very proudly. And he would take us to Reed William and so on, that area from which he came. And felly oedd David Williams yno fel dolen gyswllt rhwng o ni a Mrs Francis a fydde Waldo wedyn ni yn dod i aros i ymweld â'r Francisied yn Dinas Cross a mawr fydde'n gorfoledd ni, oedd Waldo'n hwyl, oedd e'n sbri ac oedd e'n ddireidus iawn gyda ni fel plant, gyda Gareth ac Eluned a Rodri a finne, oedd e'n ddireidus dros ben. He was always great fun to be with in the house in Dinas Cross, and it was a great joy. And when I think back to that period, great nostalgia takes over, and I'm delighted in a way to be able to relive some of the most happy episodes of my childhood and our childhood in Dinas Cross because of coming here today for this unveiling. And wedi hynny, bod cyfnod o'n i'n nabod Waldo fel cyfaill plentyndod yn Dinas Cross, wedi ni dyfu yn oedolion wedi yn y 60au nes at ddiwedd oes Waldo. Wy'n cofio Waldo yn dod i Aberystwyth i gyfarfod yr Academi Gymreig i sbonio i farddoniaeth, i drio sbonio ac egluro rhai agweddau anodd ar ei farddoniaeth. Wy'n cofio yn arbennig Waldo'n siarad am Ynys Cergwelen, un o'r darnau mwyaf ryfeddol gan Waldo. A wedyn ni, pan o'n i'n eistedd lawr i gael cino yn Aberystwyth, yn y Belfiw neu rhywle fel yna oedd eistedd lawr i gael cino, ond digwydd eistedd nesaf at Waldo, a mi ofynes iddo fe beth oedd ei ffefryn ddarnau o holl farddoniaeth y byd. beth oedd y darn oedd e'n hoffi fwyaf? I asked Waldo in this conference in Aberystwyth in the 60s, what was his favourite poem of all the poems in the world? Ac o'n i'n disgwyl darn Cymraeg gan rhywun, bardd o Gymro. A beth atebodd e oedd, heb unrhyw amheuaeth, Upper Lambourne, Berkshire, gan John Betjeman. A dyma fe'n adrodd y darn. And he said the favourite poem of all the poems in the world was Upper Lambourne in Berkshire by John Betjeman. Well, I was completely astonished, and he described the poem, how beautifully the sun caught the nettles and especially the ivy going up the church tower, and he was so delighted in the poem that he immediately leapt on a bicycle and went up to Upper Lambourne and tried to catch the sunlight on the ivy on the church tower at dawn. And he got there right at the right time. Fe gyrraeddodd just adeg y wawr, yn union ar ôl y wawr, mwyn gweld yr heilwen yn mynd lan y dail yr eiddiw, a'r heilwen yn mynd o'r eiddiw ar gerrig y tŵr yr eglwys yn Upper Lambourne. Ac wedes i, wel, geswch chi weld yr union weledigaeth oedd Betjeman wedi gweld. Na, medde fe, oedd y reithor wedi bod na ffladur yn torri popeth lawr ac yn twtio a glanhau popeth. No, I didn't have the Betjeman vision at all. He said, when I got there at dawn, the rector had been there the night before with a large scythe and cut everything down and tidied everything up, and so there was nothing going up the church tower. And I said to him, well, what did you do then? Beth nethoch chi te, Waldo? Well, nid o ar y bicycle unwaith eto a mynd nôl I Shibembro, medde fe. Ar adenydd dwyfol wynt, medde fe. And I had never realised that you could pun in Welsh before. Ar adenydd dau fol wynt, he said. That was a description of his bicycle. Ar adenydd dau fol wynt. Whereas in the hymn it says, Ar adenydd dwy fol wynt. And it was the first time I'd realised that you could pun successfully in Welsh, was Waldo. It was a very typical sort of Waldo conversation about bicycling, about vision, and about failure to attain the vision, in this mystical way that Waldo somehow or other was always emphasizing the unreachableness of the muse, the unreachable, the unattainability of poetry. Dyna oedd e'n pwysleisio bob amser. Seiclo, beth bynnag, oedd e wedi seiclo'r holl ffordd nôl I Shibembro. Wel nawr te heddi a heno ar noswaith yn union rhan fath ar noswaith honno yn 1931 yn Hoplas. Yn aros gyda'i ffrind Willie Jenkins, yr heddychwr a'r ymgeisydd llafur Shibembro yn ffarm Hoplas ger llaw yma, a noswaith o didog o haf, am rig yr hwyr, I ni'n dadorchuddio plac I Waldo cof am cofio. And we are on an exactly similar evening to that wonderful sunlit sunset that Waldo saw from the farm of Hoplas, or from the fields of Hoplas, looking down over Angle Bay. In 1931, he had this vision of the vastness of the whole generations of the past that seemed to be beyond reach, and yet he hoped that somehow or other they could be within his reach. And we are dealing with this plaque, we're unveiling this plaque on a very, very similar evening. Ni'n dadorchuddio'r plac yma ar y math o noswaith, a mae'r darn yn gorffen a oesach deil mewn cof a chalon hen bethau anghofiedig teulu dyn. One of the most famous couplets in Welsh. Is there anything that holds you in memory or in the heart, these ancient, forgotten things of the family of man? That's one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous couplet of modern Welsh poetry. A mae chi'n dod at graidd barddoniaeth yno, yr anirnadwy, yr anfesuradwy. You get to the absolute essence of the poetic experience, the attempt to grasp the ungraspable, the unfathomable. That's what he's trying to do here. And of course, it's also the essence of history as well. Those unknown generations that the historian is trying to bring back into life. And of course, it was going down to Pembrokeshire, which he always called Penfro, not Shir Benfro. It was going down to Pembrokeshire in the 40s that conversing on the beach at Pwll Gwaelod and Cwm yr Eglwys, especially Pwll Gwaelod, where Rodri and I learned to swim by swimming off the back of David Williams. He was like a lilo mat in the bay of Pwll Gwaelod, and for us to swim off. And it was hearing David talk about history that made me historian. So I owe everything to these funny meetings in Dinas Cross in the 40s with Waldo, the Francises, David Williams, Rodri, and my parents and myself. And so there is some wonderful nostalgia that has come back to me this evening. Oherwydd bod y profiad ma ges I yn y 40au, a oedd y brofiad o'n i'n dysgu nofio ar gefn David Williams ar draeth Pwll Gwaelod, Rodri'r un fath, a hefyd dyna nath I fi fod yn hanesydd oedd yr gwmniaeth rhyfeddol yma o David Williams, a Waldo, y Francisied, ag yn had a mam yn Ninas Cross yn y 40au. Felly mae'n brofiad ryfedd a cyfriniol I fi hefyd I fod yma heddi. Diolch yn fawr I chi am wrando. Wy'n galw nawr ar y mrawd hefyd I siarad ac I siarad am ei gof am Waldo. Diolch.
Nawr te. Wel, 3 o atgofion melys iawn a personol I fi am Waldo. Fel pris, wy'n I gofio fe yn dod i'n gweld ni fel teulu yn Ninas Cross. Wel, nid yn Ninas Cross, yn Bryn Henllan, reit uwch ben Pwll Gwaelod, ble o'n I wastad yn aros am y 5 mlynedd na o 46 at 1950. Ag Waldo yn dod, ag ffrindiau mawr gyda dad wrth gwrs, ond wastad yn talu lot fawr o sylw I ni fel crots. So this is the first of my personal memories of Waldo. He used to come and visit us when we would come down for a fortnight for 5 years in a row from 46, 47, 48, 49 and 1950. Those are the first holidays we ever had in the summer because you couldn't have a holiday during the war, barbed wire on the beaches and so forth. Well, a wonderful place to come on holiday, as Priest has described. And Waldo would come to spend an evening or an afternoon with us and with David Williams. Felly, fydde Waldo'n dod, ac beth yw un cofio, oedd fi a Waldo yn siarad, nid trafod barddoniaeth a ffordd o'ch chi'n cyfansoddi barddoniaeth, ond beth o'n i'n gofyn I Waldo oedd I egluro ffordd oedd e'n gallu dala set y baic, a wpo'r baic lawr, heb i'r baic gwmpo i'r un ffordd na'r ffordd arall. A fe ddechreuodd Waldo I egluro yn gwmwys ffordd eich chi'n gallu wpo'r baic, heb bod e'n cwmpo un ffordd, just drwy dala cefn y set. Ond cyn gyda bod e'n trio egluro, wrth gwrs, oedd e'n ffeili, ac oedd y baic yn cwmpo i'r un ochr na'r nath. So, what I remember is not asking Waldo, please explain how you compose poetry, because I was only 7 years old. What I was fascinated by, and Waldo always paid a lot of attention to Priest and me, as you would expect from a school teacher, I asked him how on earth he had mastered this trick of being able to wheel the bike alongside the Morgans as we walked down to Pwll Gwaelod, and he just had hold of the back of the saddle, and I couldn't believe that the bike wouldn't fall over to the right or to the left. So I asked Waldo, please explain how you, because when you're a small boy, you always want to understand how these adult tricks are done. So I said, well, explain how you do this. So he started to explain. And then, of course, once you try to explain what you're doing, you can't do it, because the bike does start to fall to the left or the right. Felly, yr egwyddor wedyn I oedd Waldo'n gweud, yw pidwch meddwl yn ormodol am bethau, just gwnewch nhw. Achos oedd rhywun dod o'r tu fewn, a mae fel cyfansoddi barddoniaeth yn y diwedd, mae'n gorfod dod o'r tu fewn. A nid achos bod chi'n athrolitho pethau yn ormodol, wedyn I fyddwch chi'n ffeili. So what he was explaining in the end was, if you over-intellectualize something, and if you try to explain things, you won't be able to do it. So I suppose there was something about how he did write poetry in that explanation to a small child, that it's best not to try to explain how you can push a bike just by hanging onto the back of the saddle. You just do it. And then, you know, you'll be okay. But once you start to explain it and you pick it apart, it's going to fail. Ail beth wedi di, wy'n cofio ar ôl i'r holl broblemau o ni ddim gallu deall ar y pryd, grotyn bach yn rhy ifanc, ynglyn â'r trwbl rhwng Waldo a'r wladwriaeth. The next memory I have, probably a little bit later, maybe 1950 or so, Waldo still in trouble with the authorities. Oedd e'n pido a talu trethu, trio talu ran o'i drethu incwm, ond ddim y ran hynny oedd yn cael ei wario ar fomiau niwclear. Rhywbeth o'r fath hyn, wrth gwrs, oedd yr wladwriaeth ddim yn hapus o gwbl bod chi fel dinesydd yn gallu dewis beth o'ch chi moyn talu amdano fe, beth o'ch chi ddim yn fodlon talu amdano fe fel bomiau niwclear. Felly, the next problem was Waldo continuing with difficulties for refusing to pay either any income tax or that part of the income tax that was going to be spent on nuclear weapons. And some peace pledge union probably told its devotees that you could work out, don't pay 10% of your income taxes, that's the part that's going on nuclear weaponry. So Waldo wouldn't pay 10% of his income tax, something like that. And of course the bailiffs had been in and had stripped his house pretty bare. Felly, beth oedd wedi digwydd? Oedd y bailiffs, neu hen ymadrodd Saesneg a Chymraeg, oedd a bum bailiff who came into your house and stripped your house of its possessions in order to be able to sell them to recover the income tax. Felly, llinell na, os dim eisiau gweddill y darn barddoniaeth, dwi'n siŵr bod hwn yn ddarn barddoniaeth o lia 4 llinell, nos nad yn fwy, ond dim ond y llinell gynta na sydd eisiau, a mae wedi taro fi yn meddwl a dwi byth wedi mynd chwaith. A glywes i ddim Waldo yn gweud hyn, ond rhywun arall yn gweud am y llinell gynta o'r ddarn barddoniaeth ar ôl i'r bailiffs i fod mewn yn y tŷ a cymeryd y celfi bant a'i gwerthu nhw. Mae'n llwm a'r bwm wedi bod. Os dim eisiau os dim eisiau trydydd llinell, ail llinell, bedwerydd llinell a dim byd, just llinell gynta na, mae'n llwm a'r bwm wedi bod. A llinell berffaith o farddoniaeth yw hwnna, achos mae'n llwmio'r holl sefyllfa lan. So this line, for the benefit of the translators, it's impossible to translate because it's got the internal Welsh rhyming, but it's bleak once the bailiffs have been. That's the best you can do in English. It is not as good as in Welsh. Mae'n llwm a'r bwm wedi bod. So he was willing to have his house pretty well stripped bare for the sake of his principles. Now, yr atgof ola, pan o'n i'n brifynidog nawr yn mynd i wneud ymweliad swyddogol gyda Estonia. Pan oedd Estonia wedi cael ei rhyddid o'r hen USSR ac wedi dod yn wlad rydd, a felly yn moyn cysylltu gyda gwledydd eraill tu fewn i'r Undeb Ewropeaidd. So my last memory that I want to convey to you tonight is how important Waldo has been to me, that when I went to Estonia after Estonia had become a free country and I'd become First Minister of Wales. I made an official visit, so you visit Tallinn, the capital city, but there's no or it didn't used to be a university in Tallinn. The university city is called Tartu, right in the middle of the country. A beautiful little place, completely dominated by the university. And by students and staff, and so anything literary or whatever will take place in Tartu, not in Tallinn, and very little happens in Tartu other than what you call, poetry readings and such like, the kind of place it is. A little bit like Oxford or Cambridge or St Andrew or Aberystwyth for that matter, university-dominated city. Felly, beth o'n i'n gorfod wneud na, nid unrhyw gyfarfodydd gwleidyddol o gwbl, ond darllen 2 ddarn o farddoniaeth, un yn Saesneg, ond gan fardd o Gymro, wrth gwrs, a dewis Dylan Thomas, wrth gwrs, mewn ffordd, a wedyn ni un yn Gymraeg, gan Waldo, wrth gwrs, a cofio, wrth gwrs. Felly, I made my choices to read Death Shall Have No Dominion by Dylan Thomas and Waldo's Cofio. And most of the Estonians there in this wonderful, gigantic pub, really. It was a pub, it was a restaurant, it was a reading room, it was a library, it was everything, really, you could want. and had a wonderful statue outside of two, it was called the Wilde bar, but I mean the same spelling as with Oscar Wilde. So what they had was, because their most famous poet is called Wilde, the same spelling as Oscar Wilde, so they had sort of two people on a park bench outside, meant to be Oscar Wilde and the Estonian poet with the same spelling of the different pronunciation, the Wilde bar. So anyway, I made my reading, fe ddarllenes i'r ddoi ddarn o farddoniaeth yn hoff I fi, ac oedd yn golygu mae'r safon ucha allech chi gael o farddoniaeth yn yr iaith Saesneg a'r iaith Gymraeg. So I read my 2 bits of poetry from Dylan Thomas's Death Shall Have No Dominion and Cofio by Waldo. And what was amazing was that they all said afterwards, even though they could understand a lot of the Dylan Thomas poem, and they couldn't understand a single word of Waldo's poem, but they much preferred Waldo's Cofio, they said, you know. Ag felly, o'n I yn syni'n fawr, ond ar ochr arall, pan o'ch I yn trio ymestyn dros y môr ag I wlad, o'n I ddim yn gwybod dim byd amdanyn nhw. Fi ddim yn meddwl bod nhw'n gwybod lot fawr am Gymru chwaith. Ond oedd rhywbeth am darn farddoniaeth Waldo oedd e'n estyn mas iddyn nhw, bod nhw ddim yn deall gair ohono fe. Ag mae hwnna'n dangos rhyw ffordd i gilydd, nid dim ond I fi, ond hefyd dwi'n meddwl I bawb sydd yn gallu cyffwrdd ar darn farddoniaeth yma, faint mae'n heiddi yr anrydedd wrth gwrs, mae'n hollol yn erbyn, os allech chi gael dyn o ddim yn hunan bwysig, Waldo oedd e. Felly fi ddim yn siŵr fel oedd yr aelod I y tylwth yn gweud, fydde fe ddim yn rhy hapus am unrhyw blac na dim byd fel yna, achos mae'n tueddu tuag at hunan bwysigrwydd. Yn diwe, os oedd unrhyw un oedd ddim yn hunan bwysig, Waldo oedd e. So, it shows, I think, that experience of mine in Estonia, how much Waldo deserves a plaque, and how much this poem deserves to be honoured internationally, as well as in Wales. But although, as his nephew said earlier, although you may not have heard this, that if there was anybody who didn't like anything self-important, and who was the furthest human being you could ever find in terms of standing back from anything that might imply self-importance, it was Waldo. So although I'm not sure he would approve, but definitely, I think all of us would approve of the unveiling of this plaque tonight. Felly, wi'n meddwl bod ni gyd yn bresennol heno yn meddwl bod ni yn anrhydeddu rhywun oedd yn heiddi yr anrhydedd yna o cael plac wedi I ddadorchuddio yma yn Rhoscrowther mwyn I anrhydeddu fe fel un o'n cewri llenyddol ni yng Nghymru. Thanks very much for listening. I think we are doing the right thing in honouring somebody, even though he might not approve of being honoured and having a plaque unveiled in his place, because it's the poetry and how long that poem will be honoured in the Welsh language and internationally. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. Right, os yw pawb yn barod, nawr i'n mynd I ddadorchuddio'r plac. 1, 2, 3.
Ddadorchuddiwn.
Na fe.
Cofio. 1 funud fach cyn elo'r haul o'r wybren. 1 funud fwyn cyn delo'r hwyr i'w hynt. I gofio am y pethau anghofiedig. Ar goll yn awr, yn llwch yr amser gynt. Fel ewyn ton a dir ar dreithell unig. Fel can y gwynt, lle nid oes glist a gliw. Mi o'n ei bod yn galw'n ofer arnom, hen bethau anghofiedig dynol ryw. Camp a chelfyddyd y cenhedloedd cynnar, a neddau bychain a neuaddau mawr. Y chwedlau cain a chwalwyd ers canrifoedd. Y diwiau na wyr neb amdanynt nawr. A geiriau bach hen ieithoedd diflanedig. Hoiw yng ngenau dynion oedd hi'n twy, a thlws i'r glist ymharabl plant bychain. Ond tafod neb ni eilw arnynt mwy. O genedlaethau dirifedi deiar, a'i breuddwyd dwyfol a'i dwyfoldeb brau. A erys ond tawelwch i'r calonnau, fi gynt yn llawenychu a thristau. Mynych ymrig yr hwyr, a mi yn unig. Daw hiraeth am eich nabod chwi bob un. A oes a'ch deil o hyd mewn cof a chalon, hyn bethau anghofiedig teulu dyn.
It's a great honour and it's a privilege to have this chance of addressing an audience that includes, I know, many who were related to Waldo or who knew him well. And that fact does in some ways cause me a little unease, partly reminded of the occasion when I turned up to lecture to Gynnog on R.S. Thomas, only to discover in the front row R.S. Thomas. Very fortunately, he forgave me and we became good friends, but it was rather an awkward occasion. It's partly intimidating for that reason. It's partly intimidating because of what next I need to confess. I'm not really here to reinforce the familiar image of Waldo. I'm not here to talk about Waldo as annoyed, as lovable, as impish, as witty, as humorous, or as a visionary innocent, or even as an exemplary and inspiring social activist. He was all those things. People have testified many times to it, and also, of course, to his remarkable charismatic presence. It's just I have this hunch that that's not where the poetry comes from. At least so I feel. And what I have to say is, first of all, it involves recognizing that some of his greatest poetry is difficult poetry, and that it is so with a reason. Because for all his simplicity and innocence, unaffected though he was an extremely complex man. And I would suggest he was a conflicted man. So what I'm going to try to do is reflect on what I call the dark sources of his extraordinary poetry, a poetry that in another sense could be said to have been filled with light. What on earth does my title mean? The nobility of poetry. It's a potentially rather pretentious sounding phrase, but I do think it applies to Waldo Williams's case. It was coined by one of the very greatest poets of the 20th century, the American Wallace Stevens. And Stevens went on to say something even more strange, and he defined it. The nobility of poetry, he said, is a violence from within that protects us from a violence without. What on earth did he mean? Well, the violence from without was the world as it is given to us, as we experience it, the status quo, which in a sense we come to accept as inevitable, as unchangeable. The violence from within that reacts to that is the violence of our own imagination and its power to imagine an alternative world. A different world, a world different from that which we have been given. What it shows us is that that world, the familiar world, is after all only an imagined world, exactly like the other. And they are both of them human worlds. And for not only Wallace Stevens, but Seamus Heaney, whom you've heard of, and who actually quoted that phrase of Wallace Stevens, obviously feeling it to be close to his own heart. The nobility of poetry, said Heaney, is the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality. The imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality. The imagination is central to all of these poets, you'll notice. And for them all, including Waldo, the imagination is central because for them all, it is central to our humanity. It is what, as it were, makes us fully human. Now, that view of poetry as being essential is unfashionable. We are living in a mass consumer society, and all forms of art in this society of ours are treated and regarded merely as forms of entertainment. But Heaney had in mind what we so easily forget, the extraordinary central role poetry had played in supporting opposition to vicious Stalinist Russia. When, following Stevens, Heaney spoke of the nobility of poetry, what he had in mind was the heroic role of great Soviet writers such as Anna Akhmatova and Osip Mandelstam. And it's a sobering fact that of the 700 or so delegates to the first meeting of the Soviet Writers' Association in the 1930s, of the 700, only 10 were to survive Stalin's purges. Now, to be a poet under those circumstances is to take poetry seriously. And it is, as it were, to demonstrate through a practice of it the nobility of poetry, as Stevens and I think as Waldo Williams understood it. To put it crudely, dictators have understood the power of the imagination, particularly as expressed through poetry in the arts. They've understood it much better than does our modern world of mass entertainment. Well, of course, Wallace Stevens was no Mandelstam, and yet he was. Mandelstam, you probably know, ended up dying in a Soviet prison. Waldo came close through protesting, as he did, against what he regarded as a much more humane and civilized form of tyranny. Almost ended up as a guest, like Nicholas Grice, of one of Her Majesty's prisons in Swansea. There should be a plaque in Swansea prison, talking about plaques, to commemorate Nicholas Grice and others. What was it that Waldo was protesting against? Well, you know what it was. It was the tyranny of the state. Regardless of whether that state took a capitalist, a communist, or even a state socialist form. For him, this was the monster, or Tom Pauline has called the Minotaur, because it's got this malign power to destroy individual liberty and individual conscience. And also, I'm sure Waldo would add, the power to destroy powerless languages and peoples and cultures with an imperial blitheness. Several of those occasions when Waldo was moved to take a heroic public stand against such tyranny are well known to you, well documented. His pacifism we've heard about in World War I, his refusal during the Korean War to pay his taxes for reasons that Rodley were explaining. He was consciously stepping in the footsteps of people like Gandhi and Thoreau, both of them great heroes of his. And he was protesting against what Eisenhower in the 1950s called the military-industrial complex. Exactly how Waldo saw it of the Western world. And as you know, he used to engage with it locally here in Pembrokeshire through his resistance to the military occupation, including Castlemartin, of course, that he experienced. You also know the many and varied influences on Waldo's alternative spiritual and socio-political values. His Christian anarchist vision was a blend of the radical individualism of the Welsh tradition of descent and a form of socialism rooted in a utopian communitarianism. And he's been convinced largely by the great English Romantics that the great creative principle of the imagination was the divine indwelling in humanity. And so he's indebted to Blake, to Shelley, to Ruskin, to Carlyle, to William Morris, to Ralph Waldo Emerson, to Walt Whitman. I almost decided to talk about Waldo and Walt Whitman. The link there was Edward Carpenter, huge influence on Waldo, Tolstoy, Berdyaev, you go on and go on. There are many of them. And equally important, of course, were such figures as his father, his uncle Guillermo's, through whom this culture of conscientious objection, radical dissent, and social gospel was mediated. Then there was the impressive tradition of free thinking, of social protest, such as the Rebecca riots, local to his native district and to Carmarthenshire and Cardiganshire. Now, all of this is known. All of this is well understood, and his importance for his poetry can't be overestimated. But it's been done. It's pointless my saying it all over again. So I want to concentrate on an aspect of Waldo I don't think has had so much attention. I've mentioned it in passing already, and I have in mind his deeply troubled and conflicted inner life, which meant that for all his vaunted mystical quietism, which is what we make much of very rightly, his soul was, I think, in a permanent state of radical disquiet. His imagination was always under duress. After all, there's nothing unusual about Waldo's social spiritual philosophy, as I've crudely outlined it. Now, how he embodied it and how he gave charismatic presence and expression to it is different. But the actual matter of the philosophy is not really original, although sometimes we treat it as if it were. It's the sources of energy that transformed that into a worldview that we so value. That's what interests me. You have to accept, of course, that Waldo was a divinely gifted lord of language, as Wallace Stevens put it, gifted beyond the imagination of ordinary man and woman. But what was it that galvanized that into electrifying expression? And for me, it's his psychic struggles. And I think they took a form that was violent within him. The mild, peaceable pacifist Waldo, or so I want provocatively to suggest, was in his way a violent man. It's worth recalling that after Waldo had, you'll remember the incident at Bwtunog, when he intemperately sandwiched the head of a boy between the lid of the desk and, the bottom of the desk. Yeah? And you'll remember what he was called after that in Bwtunog. Waldo Williams. Not Waldo Williams, but Waldo Williams. Clouter Williams. Affectionately, but I think perceptively. And when driven to frustration, he could indeed give vent to flashes of what others regarded as unreasoning anger. And there was, I would guess, a lot of pent, coiled-up tension in Waldo, which could come out as humour as well, and that's in his poetry. Well, like Stevens, Waldo was aware of how damaging, as it were, reality as you may experience it all around you, particularly when you're very young, how damaging that could be. You remember in a great part of his statement against the Korean War, he said, "The old customs and traditions of our civilization have sucked the imagination out of our brains, so that we cannot even conceive of different alternative conditions." And that's what he was struggling to do in all his poetry, to struggle for these alternative conditions. The struggle, as I say, the difficulty, the violence, the psychic struggle was an integral part of him. I think it powered his creative life. Where did it come from? You may well know this. I must say I hadn't been so aware of it till I read Alan Llwyd's biography. Alan just makes passing mention of it, but for me, I think it's central. It centres on Alan's discovery of, in his papers, in Waldo's papers in Aberystwyth, a very remarkable confession, which you probably know. Well, he confessed only to very closest intimates and very reluctantly. What he confessed was that when he was about 4 years old, he awoke in the dead of night to find he was being stared at by his father's mad eyes, just a foot away from his face. He was hauled from sleep. He was only just saved from a severe beating by his father for some insanely imaginary transgression. He was saved from that only by his mother, who interceded. It was at the beginning of some 3 years, remember, Waldo was 4, of domestic hell. during which the little boy not only felt vulnerable, but fearful. He's afraid his father would carry out his threat, which was always to abandon the family and leave home. And in later life, Waldo confessed he'd felt guilt at having supposedly driven his father to want to leave. But he'd also felt guilt at actually wishing his father would leave. He heartbreakingly reports how he and his siblings would tiptoe to their parents' bedroom door and eavesdrop in an attempt to overhear whether there was any chance of domestic peace. He also spent time hanging about the house, 4, 5, 6, not going to school. Why? Just in case he was needed to protect his mother from his father's violence. Never happened. But imagine the effect of that on a little boy. Not surprisingly, when his parents ultimately passed away some 30 years later, Waldo suffered a major mental breakdown, and it required extended treatment as an outpatient at Whitchurch Mental Hospital. And there, one of his doctors was actually moved to tears by Waldo's recollections of his traumatic childhood, describing his experience during that period as sheer hell. Moreover, Waldo himself came to realize that an image of God modelled on his father was wholly antipathetic to him. The only God in whom he could place his faith was his own God, an alternative God, a God within, who made himself known by private, unorthodox, secret, restorative ways. Now this was the deeply disturbed ground from which Waldo's mysticism duly grew. Now the implications of it, just think it through, they're crystal clear. No wonder he harboured throughout his life a visceral horror of violence that of course found expression in his crusading pacifism. Or that those terrible years of feeling totally helpless resulted in the formation of a personality that was almost pathologically averse, independent, unwilling to be controlled by others, fiercely determined to defend his individual liberty. Even his great friend D.J. Williams found him to be willfully principled and exasperatingly obstinate. No wonder either that, having experienced his mother as his sole protector during those terrible years, he idealized the female principle. Or that, having had his own childhood development violently arrested, he retained, and Rodri mentions it, in the eyes of his acquaintances, a kind of wistfully childlike quality in his adulthood, and that he enjoyed a naturally intimate relationship with small children. That doesn't surprise me at all. Moreover, recent research at Harvard into acute cases such as his have interestingly concluded that early trauma of this kind actually has physical results. It results in neurological damage, so the young victim's neurological system is permanently rewired, so that throughout life, such a child will suffer a heightened sensitivity to surroundings. His nervous system, in other words, is standing at red alert. Now, there seems to be clear evidence that as a person, Waldo, nervously restless, suffered from this hypersensitivity. Paradoxically, of course, it actually benefited him as a poet. And doesn't the dread of domestic rupture split? Yeah, that's what was behind it. The dread of domestic rupture, his own imagined responsibility for it, that haunted Waldo all his life, like a dark passion. Doesn't that underlie his obsession with Cavani, with integration, with reconciliation, with bringing everybody together? No wonder he was preoccupied with that. It's seminal to his poetry. And then there's that aspect of his case that the psychiatrist at Whitchurch summarized in a word, really. His wholly groundless sense of personal guilt, Kafkaesque in character, his father, in his unbalanced moods, accused the little boy of some unspecified crime, vaguely connected with what he described as a failure to take responsibility. No wonder Waldo spent so much of his time desperately making amends for this, by willing himself to take personal responsibility. For the Second World War, for the Korean War, for the plight of the Welsh language, for the condition of Wales, for the state of humanity. Bless him. He may even have gained some psychological relief by doing so, relief from what, you might ask? Well, this is the word I was coming to, psychiatrists use, capital A, anxiety. Never before, they said, in their extensive experience, and Waldo ruefully reports this, had they come across such an extreme and chronic case of generalized, unfocused anxiety as his. It was that anxiety, I think, that was the dark awen, or muse, of his poetry. That's what I've been trying to argue, okay? Now, a term that's been fruitfully used to illuminate R.S. Thomas's poetry is the term unheimlich, from the German. It's normally translated as the uncanny. It's the term Freud uses to identify those common instances when we can be radically unnerved by the familiar, all around us, suddenly assuming briefly a strange aspect. The world that we take for granted suddenly seems odd. At the same time, it's familiar. I think it is at the root of several of Waldo's greatest poems. I think it nurtured his mysticism. And I can't help but trace it back to those early years when Waldo the child found his own hearth and home, of all places, what he was familiar with, turned monstrous and unpredictable. The early experience of the undermining of the self-assurance of a fledgling ego and of its confidence in the solid reliability of his environment, he never knew that. And that seems to me a crucial formative influence on his development. I won't take it much longer, and I'm trying not, as it were, to use a reductive language, but I need to explore a little further along these psychocritical lines. Some 3 years after his mental collapse, Waldo's father began to make what turned out to be a full recovery, though he remained thereafter prone to depressive episodes, as was Waldo throughout his life. Gradually, therefore, the young Waldo, who was about now 7 years old, must have realized that in his madness, when he was mentally ill, his father hadn't been truly himself. That underlying the madness, there was the real person. And isn't that how Waldo came to see human existence? Didn't he come to believe that within the monstrous moral madness of human beings, there always lay the divine principle, the inner light of the true nature of human beings? It is the function of poetry for Waldo to retrieve that buried light, to release it. And there's the interesting fact that the recovery by his father of mental health coincided almost exactly with, you know what? At 7, the family's move to Monachlog V. Right? Now think that one through. So I haven't had time to research this, but I discovered the other day that current child psychiatrists place great emphasis on the age 7. Apparently there are huge changes at that age in the little child's brain. And that's when, I think, Waldo went to Monachlog V, and the result was, as we know, a sort of personal transfiguration. No wonder that he felt that the community there, a community, right, was one where he could feel safe. Right? No wonder he came to love it all his life and to invest it with this, glow, this halo, right, of significance. It had a sacred, luminous quality. And yes, Waldo makes much of terms like home and house and family, but even more important, he makes much of community. That wider, as it were, network, which, if anything, is much more durable for him, right, and can be trusted much better. Also, he displaces it onto the landscape, because there's a sense in which even human beings can't always satisfy him now with what he needs, but the Preseli can. Yeah? So the Preseli become, Asgwr and Cefen, the backbone of his being. That doesn't surprise me. It's like Wordsworth, actually. Yeah? That go to that, one of the poets that Waldo, not surprisingly, admired enormously. Wordsworth orphaned, of course, at the age of whatever he was, 3 or 4. Right. Well, I probably just shocked you and disturbed you, but I should say my argument is not that the great mystical Waldo really is simply a psychological basket case. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, if he hadn't had those troubles, I'm not sure that he would have developed the intensity of mystical vision that he did. Paradoxically, it became an enabling part of his life, but it was a darkness turned into light. And I think that too is a theme that runs through the poetry. Before I give a couple of examples of that, and I hope I won't keep it too long, I should just note, in case you doubt it, there are poems of Waldo where he doesn't turn darkness into light. And you should note those. They are like the great dejection poems of the great English romantics, whom he so admired. One is A Plant Marw, the dead children. What can you say about that? The poem is about the impossibility of saying anything about that. Right? It's an anti-poem. And that doesn't try to as it were, magic the horror of it away into any form of affirmation. It just registers it. Then there's the first section of O Breathe, O Earth, which is a savagely Darwinian account of both the natural world and of human life. As for the second section, which implicitly accepts that human life is beyond redemption, then that's where it turns into a desperate creed to cure for escape to what Priest mentioned earlier, the remote islands of Kerguelen, because they're pristine in their annihilating iciness. Right? They're unpolluted by the human, Right? So that's where you begin to sense, as it were, a presence of a God beyond. And then there's Can Bomb, the Song of the Bomb, which is Waldo's equivalent of a song from Ted Hughes' nihilistic sequence of crow poems. It's a parody of a hymn. It ends in a sort of ecstatic conflation of the human drive to power and to death, as the atom power exults in the elimination of the whole human race. Mi I hysgubaf I dan, ecstasy angai. A much more complex case is one you've got on your sheets. I'm going to refer to it more than read it. I'm assuming knowledge, or at least, if not, then read it. Cwmwl Haf, Summer Cloud. It's a great poem, and as most of you know, it relates to Waldo's recollections of that crucial period in his young life when, as a 7-year-old, he arrived in Mynachbog Ddu, and that was immediately following, you remember, those dreadful years of his father's mental breakdown. Well, it was therefore, and the poem conveys this wonderful, it was a time when the natural world seemed newly blessed, when the stallion's prancing hooves drummed a psalm of praise, and the stately cattle ceremonially paraded their way home, their full udders parting the reeds, their horns pillars sustaining the sky. Waldo movingly sums up the time as one when ymhob tywydd diogelwch oedd y tywydd. Caredigrwydd oedd y tŷ. Safety at long last, after long danger, was permanently abroad, present in all weathers, even at home, so long the sight of unpredictable anger. But then, as I read it, the terrible anxiety that haunted the 3 previous crucial years of Waldo resurfaces, that he was to do throughout his life. It comes in the form of the descent of a summer cloud that, in enveloping him, steadily obliterates all landscapes, and it brings with it a desolating terror of complete helplessness, violating the integrity of the little boy's vulnerable personal identity. And for me, it's no accident that the cloud is explicitly gendered male. It's the spirit of a great giant. It appears totally unexpectedly, just as his seemingly omnipotent father's eruptions have been wholly unpredictable. The poem I'm very crudely suggesting can be read at this level. It's also a great mystical poem, of course, about an extraordinary encounter with the otherness of the ground of being. But I'm looking at it from the point of view of psychological origins and how they're also there. It's the male principle that's the destructive force. It's the female principle that's invoked at the end of the poem as the healing force. Critics have made a lot of the fact that the poem ends with a return to the home, to the house at the end of Cwmwl Haf. What they don't notice so much is that the house is specifically connected with the mother, the mother's domain. Ac o cyn cyrraedd drws y cefn, sŵn adeiladu daiar newydd a nefoedd newydd ar lawr y gegin, oedd clocs mam i mi. And oh, before even reaching the back door, the sound of the building of a new heaven and new earth reached me in the sound of mother's clogs on the kitchen floor. The sense of relief captured in those lines, the relief of having discovered refuge, is to me palpable and deeply moving. And it's worth noticing that what Waldo is registering and remembering is sound in the form of rhythm, metric rhythm. That's what's reassuring. And that's what poetry is. It's exactly what poetry is. The sound of his mother's clogs on the kitchen floor. It has that regularity to it. It's a stabilizer of the self. I think we can bear that in mind as we turn to another of Waldo's greatest visionary achievements. I think it's a breathtakingly beautiful love poem. It's a very difficult poem. It's a celebration of his recent marriage to his beloved wife Linda, which is only to last a year. And it starts on your sheets. Oherwydd ein dyfod i'r ystafell dawel, yn yr ogof i amser yr oedd. A'n myned allan I fan y fri ygwreiddiau, ac I afalau perlanoedd. A'n myned allan trwy'r wythiau'n dywyll I oleini yr aelwydydd, a mi'n dilyn y galon gynnes, seren fy nos, a'r hun fy nydd. It's an astonishing poem. What does it mean? It's certainly a poem instinct with the rapture of wonder and of gratitude. It all hinges on, as made possible by that remarkable opening, oherwydd ein dyfod. Because we came, not we came, oherwydd ein dyfod. Oherwydd. It's conditional. Because of our coming to the quiet chamber, everything else flowed from that. Ein dyfod itself, our coming, is actually, you think of it, a fusion of verb and noun. The coming, they're both noun, verb can be used both ways in English as well. It therefore infuses an established state, which is actually, as the marriage between Waldo and Linda, with a dynamism of continuous process. It is, one might say, a case of a verb that's come to stay. And in this context, it perfectly registers what I think the opening stanza is all about, the risky, ongoing commitment to mutuality that any actively meaningful marriage never ceases to be. Oherwydd ein dyfod. Because we took that risk, because we took that step, because we took that step of trusting in each other, then the whole fertility of the universe, the bounty of it, is ours. I think the poem radiates a sensual and sexual charge, actually, which is unparalleled in Waldo's writing. And it all stems from that first fateful, riskily intimate, vulnerable step the lovers took of setting up house together, of committing themselves, therefore, utterly and irrevocably to each other. That was the outgoing step that took them out of time into the timeless cave at Ogof and provided them with passage out into the miraculous fertility and paradisal bounty of cosmic life. It is, of course, the paradise of Avallon, as suggested by afalau perlanoedd, the apples of orchards. The poem looks back to wartime, when Waldo was newly married and Linda had bought a pair of blackout curtains so thick that Waldo complained they turned the house into a cave. Okay? Oherwydd ein dyfod i'r ogof. Yeah? In the reference to ogof, the amser, the timeless cave, that mundane actuality is magically transmuted, retrospectively, years after poor Linda's early death, into a kind of nurturing womb of all existence, a pure potency. And of course, under blackout conditions, the dark does assume a new potency, and even light, therefore, takes on a quality precious and perilous. And Linda, therefore, becomes Beatrice, if you look at it, to Waldo's Dante, his guidance star, trwy'r wythiau'n dywyll I oleini yr aelwydydd, through the dark vein or seen to the light of halves. Interaction of light and dark. And if you look at it in the Welsh, you've got an interplay of sounds like the chain reaction of an atomic explosion, Wa, we, you, I, we. They're all of them mutations of each other, okay, right? And as for the incomplete and indeterminate structure of the syntax, that's made endlessly argue over, where the main verb is, etc. That's baffled so many critics. I just think it seems to me deliberate. It seems to me to capture perfectly the sensation of entering a realm of experience that is totally beyond the familiar and orientating sequentialities of ordinary time-bound life and ordinary time-bound language. That's why it is like that, you know. Okay. Oh, I better stop or I'll smother the poem in commentary. Somebody once said that criticism is the revenge of the reason and the imagination, you know. I have to say, I sympathise with that. What I'm trying to emphasise is that the whole poem is predicated on anxiety, the anxiety of risk upon entering marriage. And that at its heart lies the interdependence of dark and light, the transmutation of risk into rapture. They, for me, are the telltale signs of Waldo's poetry. And they're there again in the great visionary poem Aeoliciae, Snowdrops. You've got that on your sheets. That opens on an ecstatic, now famous note of acclamation. Gwyn, Gwyn, yw'r gynnar dorf ar lawr y glyn, o'r ddaiar ddi y nef a'i myn, golau a'i pryn o'i gwely prydd, a rhed y gwanwyn yn ddi glwy o'i coffro hwy, uwch cae a ffrydd. Black Earth is actively forced here by heaven to yield up the white flowers that signify purity. It is an act of redemptive violence. A striking instance of Waldo's obsession with the effortful challenge of turning darkness into light, of what is deathly into life-bearing. And I've tried to explain the connections with his own psychohistory. It's that vital initial act of transmutation that makes the riot of light that spring actually possible. And the whole process is then steeped in the Christian language of the initial buying of salvation, the price paid to enable resurrection into fullness of redeemed life. It's from the wounds that suffered by Christ on the cross that flow all the unscarred life of spring. Central to the poem, I want to stress, is Waldo's joyously awed celebration of the recklessness of a God who risks all on a beauty so frail as that of the pure white snowdrops, backing that beauty to be tough enough to go there clear, to bear all blows. And the poem ends with Waldo invoking such a poet, such a God as, what? A bard, a poet. His God is a poet. Okay? It therefore means that whatever he says about his God is also true of what way that Waldo sees a poet. So we can safely conclude that for Waldo, a poet is also similarly reckless in the faith he invests in his power to turn dark into light, that he's similarly violent in the demands he makes of recalcitrant reality, just as Stephen said. He's similarly toughly resilient, so that his poetry is capable of holding its face, holding its own in the face of the most brutal actuality. Rhoscrowther is about the way in which purity is not only beautiful but powerful, violently so in its very innocence, exactly like Waldo, because of what it has to encounter and overcome. In the opening stanza, I've quoted, look at it now, do a bit of prakrit, just for a second, it's interesting. All except one of the rhyming words in that first stanza are monosyllabic, and they're violently accentuated. Okay? So you have gwyn, glyn, min, prydd, ffrydd, yeah? The only exception is the last line, but one where you have the glwy, which is also the word without a partner in rhyme. All the others rhyme. Absolutely rhyme. Monorhyme. This one doesn't, except you then notice that the "the" is actually a reversal of the "ith" you get in prydd and in ffrydd. So it's still there. And then, of course, there's the elaborate internal rhyming, min with pryn and with gwanwyn, a word which actually includes gwyn, of course. You know, wyn, gwan, wyn. Punning, as we said. Why on earth do I fuss over all this? Because I think Waldo has fashioned the equivalent of an icon, except it's in sound. I think Aeoliciae is a verbal icon. The intricate interplay of sounds highlights in a stylized hieratic fashion the spiritual dynamic with which the whole poem is concerned. It links gwyn, whiteness, purity, directly to power, because it rhymes with min, and links both of them through sound to the risk of self-sacrifice, pryn, before linking all this to gwanwyn. The sound links the important words. Right? Highlights the process for you, in other words, what I'm trying to say. Right? The chain reaction I forgot about earlier. And the heavy end rhymes, they function in a similar fashion. They convey the remorselessness of the poem, the commitment of the poet and his God to the reckless, risky vision of the redemptive power of purity. They enact the unstoppable drive to transmute dark into light, which the poem is all about. Right, that's enough, isn't it? I'd love to go on. I already overstayed my welcome. So I'll move towards my conclusion and mention one other poem. Of course, I've given you a selective picture of Waldo. I've had nothing to say about his mischievous humour, about his extraordinary combination of deep complexity and piercing simplicity, about the internationalist dimension of his nationalism, or about his shamingly courageous activism, more challengingly relevant than anything ever to our own times. All I can say is I don't think that in so doing I entirely slight important truths about Waldo. His early friend Will Evan said, Waldo's solemn inside finds relief in concocting impossible limericks and parodies. The Abergwaun Waldo is himself more Waldos than one. Those limericks, funny, mischievous, witty, but they're the product of the solemn insides of Waldo in the end, as is the great poetry. Well, the last poem, just a bit of it I want to look at, is Caniad e Hedydd, on your sheets. It starts, just the first stanza, Ymrof i'r wybren, yn genad angen fel dridwy Branwen yn i'r cyfyngder. Codaf o'r cynni, am can yn egni, Herodr goleini yn Richelder. Waldo was besotted with Shelley, and this is a poem clearly that in some way echoes Shelley's, but also does so actually to mark the difference of Waldo's vision from that of Shelley. Because Shelley's bird soars exultantly into the empyrean. This skylark, it doesn't arise effortlessly from earth. Instead, it is an effort. Ymrof i'r wybren. Nid ysgynaf. I give myself to heaven. It ventures to yield itself up to the sky, to take that risk as a messenger of earth's need. It is, says Waldo, in a reference to which the whole poem thereafter hinges, like Branwen's starling. Now, you won't need to be reminded, Branwen was, according to the Mabinogion, the daughter of Llyr, who married her off to Matholwch, king of Ireland, where, what happened? She eventually found herself skivvying in the kitchen. And there she tamed a starling and taught it in a twist on the Welsh bardic convention of sending a bird through as a llatai, a messenger of love. She sends her starling to carry a message of distress back to Wales, summoning her brother Bran to liberate her. For Waldo, the story becomes an allegory of the role of the poet in the contemporary world, which is to act, as his poem about the skylark explains, as an empowering messenger of hope to all the countries of the world, and as an instigator of rebellion against oppression of every kind. Skylark's song in this opening stanza is instinct with energy and power, and the bird becomes a herald, trumpeting the majestic entrance of light into the world. So the poem is one of Waldo's many stirring protests against social injustice, but surely, given my heavy-handed treatment of the subject in this lecture, you'll have realised something else as well. What's the essence of the story of Branwen? It is domestic abuse. It's a story of terror on the domestic hearth. When, therefore, Waldo here invokes his skylark, and with it his poem, as cenad angen, the messenger of need, fel dydwy Branwen yn i'r cyfyngder, message of need in an hour of crisis. Isn't he also movingly revealing the vital role of his poetry and the vital role of that poetry in his own life? Isn't he acknowledging the part that poetry, as the product and messenger of his very deepest inward needs, has played in transferring chronic and potentially crippling anxiety into courageous social action and into a mystic faith in the contagion of goodness? Had I been invited to deliver my lecture in Welsh this evening, I'd have entitled it Waldo Williams, Cenad Angen. But as it was, I, of course, had to choose a different title, Waldo Williams and the Nobility of Poetry. The nobility of poetry, said Wallace Stevens, is, you can recite it now, a violence from within that protects us from the violence without. It is, we could now say, the skylark's violent effort to rise above earth, its risky refusal to obey the law of gravity, as Simone Weil put it, you'll remember. And all of this becomes magically transfigured into a song that is the herald of light. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi.